Hi, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. Steve Andrews here, and today I'm going to show you a bit of archive footage from 2017. This is already on YouTube, and I have put a link to the original in the community page, but I thought I'd edit it down and recontextualize it for you. So I managed to get a copy from Gavin Chait, the author who I interview in this piece. It is a bookshop event I did in 2017, part of my Hardwired strand. And just to tell you more about Gavin, Gavin was born in Cape Town in 1974, came to the UK about 10 years ago. He's recently moved to Marseille in France, and he kindly let me have a copy of the video that he took at the time. I would say when you watch it, do turn the volume up because it is quieter than what I normally broadcast, so do be prepared and turn your volume up. And it'll give you an insight into Gavin's work. I've edited his reading down slightly because the piece is very, very long. You'll also see me in action, so it's really just an opportunity for you to see the sort of thing that I was doing 5 years ago when I was doing a lot of SF events. Just to talk about his work, it's very interesting. He's published 2 novels, one called Our Memory Like Dust, which came out in 2017, and that was the one we were talking about at the time this archive footage was shot. And his first novel, Lament for the Fallen, which was kind of described as an African man who fell to earth. They're both very good books. They're quite dense. There's a lot in them. They're social SF. They do have their hard SF moments. And as I say, Gavin is a South African, a white South African. He's got several science degrees. He's a real sort of Renaissance man. He's up to all sorts of stuff. And he's working on his 3rd novel, which is a more traditional hard SF idea, but it's a rather interesting idea, which I'm not going to talk about now because you can't copyright ideas. So I would say watch out for that when that happens. And he's got his fingers in all sorts of pies. He's doing all sorts of stuff. So he's a really interesting chap and a really nice guy. So this is just so you can see me and Gavin in action. Also, somebody was in the audience that night who you won't see but you will hear because she asked some very pertinent questions, and I'll identify her using some subtitles when she pops up, is Emma Newman, another science fiction writer I've talked about on this channel who's very, very good indeed. I'm shooting this in the day after that mini heavy heat wave we had towards the end of July. You probably won't see this till mid-August. I am undergoing some extensive dental treatment for a couple of weeks in August, so the frequency of the posts may have declined a bit, and that's why I'll probably have already mentioned that in the community sort of page. So this is a little look at an archive piece. If you've seen it before, I apologize. Do have a look at it again. It just gives you an idea of the sort of thing that I do when I do an event. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. I'm going to sign up for now, and this is the time machine moment when we travel back to 2017. Anyway, without further ado, so I've rabbited on a bit. Tonight we have a special guest who's come down to Bath. Thanks very much for coming, Gavin. It's great to see you. It's been great sort of corresponding with you about your work. And your charming wife has brought this lovely beer, which is really, really nice, and I'm looking forward to another glass. And one of the reasons why I chose to have Gavin along is I wanted to get some rising stars along, and Gavin's work immediately attracted my interest. First of all, there's the stunning book jackets, and the designer and the publisher did a lovely job, and immediately you look at them and you think, what is going on here? The original, they're different, and they say something about the setting of Gavin's work. And they've actually been really popular as well. We've had people come in and they've bought the books purely because they're so beautiful, which is always gratifying, because that makes it a nice, easy sale. But at the same time, for us, it's great because there's something of real substance inside. I'm going to ask Gavin to take the floor and tell us about his background and his work, and he's going to do some readings for us. Yeah. And Gavin, I'm going to hand things over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, Gavin Chait. Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to see so many people, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm going to sort of start in the middle and then flesh it out from there. When I came to writing the second novel, the age in which we're living in, you obviously start writing quite a long time before you eventually get the book in your hand. So it was 2 years ago, before Trump, before Brexit, before any of that was even on the horizon. And we were starting to see a lot of instability, and where we seem to be is that we are at war for control of our founding mythology, of who we are, of the stories that we tell ourselves that reinforce our sense of who we are, of where we're from, of us, of them. And within that mythology, it can lead us to great compassion or to commit terrible acts of harm. And one of the greatest founding mythologies in Western culture is the story of Exodus, which is at its core a story of refugees fleeing slavery and oppression, who crossed an ocean and a desert, who fought a war for control of territory, founded an empire that was so powerful that its culture and myths have been incorporated into half the planet's cultures and myths. And we are living through as profound a period of time where our stories about ourselves are contradicting our sense of ourselves, of our nations, of defined borders, and our personal identity. And I ask myself, what is happening here and how will we be remembered? And more importantly, the stories that we're telling, what will they look like in transition on their way to becoming new founding myths? So I'm going to start you slap bang in the middle, and for those of you who haven't read anything by me before, give you a tremendous sense of where I come from. Even the dry dust sings when the rains return. As temperatures rise, clouds mass over the ocean, and Atlantic winds push them into the coast, where water falls in great big drenching clods. The earth drinks hungrily and quickly, like one permitted but a single annual feast, for the hibernage will last only briefly. Sloughs and marigot's fill, rivers rise, and water stampedes for the shore. Villages all along these ancient desert watercourses trap the fleeing waters in reservoirs and dikes, there to store what they need to use themselves, for their beasts and their crops. Lac de Guise, upon which much of northern Senegal depends, fills, and for a time the conflict between the sugar plantations, subsistence farmers, nomadic herders, and cities subsides. For water is scarce, the dry is long, and all struggle under the burning heat. With the rains, migratory birds come sweeping in along the coast, great clouds of pelicans and flamingos, gargany, shoveler, and ruff. Many have crossed the deserts of the Mediterranean and the Sahara. They settle in the Djoudj wetland, where they may rest, some to stay, some to travel again further south. Their flight takes them over the surging banks of the Senegal River, where small overloaded pirogues and boats cross back and forth, ferrying trade goods and people between villages and farms on either side of what was once the border between Senegal and Mauritania. One of these pirogues is travelling rapidly downriver, cutting across ferries and passing slower barges distributing food and medical supplies to thousands of seekers camped along the banks. It began its journey 4 days ago at the river confluence near Ballard, where the waters of the Falem join those of the Senegal, and will reach the port city of St. Louis tomorrow. Shakisa, leaning out from the bow, looks up to watch the scudding flocks overhead, exhilarated as the wind clutches at her hair and warm rain pools in the folds of her poncho. Tuft is curled in sleep beneath her waterproof, escaping spurts sloshing through tears in the awning over the boat as it rocks in the current. Mademoiselle, says Mustafa, her guide, boat pilot, sitting miserably in a puddle alongside the motor. Where do you wish to stop? It is growing late. He had assumed that their journey would be leisurely. He would do a little fishing, meet with friends in villages along the way, perhaps do some trading. Instead, they have hurried along as if all the genii are upon them, on the river before dawn each morning, and only stopping to rest upon the bank well after dark. And her curiosity, she asked questions of everyone. How long have they lived here? What do they farm? How much do they produce? If they are seekers, she asks even more questions. Where have they come from? What was their journey like? Where will they go next? Their family said, said there's a big seeker gathering at Macau. I think we can get there in 2 hours, she says, without looking back, grinning as she sends him shaking his head and crouching further in his sodden jalaba. Flecks of grey and gold dapple the river, its forested flanks growing darker as the sun sets. Through the trees and over the water comes the sound of drumming and singing, and as they round a bend, they near a seeker camp sprawled along the shore. Mustafa drifts into the beach, nudging their craft between 2 other boats. He eases himself upright, drops over the side into knee-deep water, drags a muddy rope up onto the bank and anchors it to the shore. Mademoiselle, he says, returning to the boat, where Shakiso is collecting her backpack and preparing to carry Tuft. Same time tomorrow, asked with a hint of despair that would be far too early. Yes, same time, hopping off the bow into the water. She deposits Tuft onto the relatively dry sand above the beach and heads towards the loudest of the competing groups of singers. Tuft stretches and yawns, glares at the boat and follows. This camp is a strange hybrid of transience and permanence. Sandy paths are wide and hardened by countless passing feet. Tents abut thick-walled clay houses and improvised rooms of corrugated iron and plastic sheeting. Goats and children run and play in the narrow alleyways between the houses. An open muddy square tucked in amongst the houses and alive with the hoots and calls of young men and women playing football is surrounded by food stalls. She queues at a tiny restaurant, squeezing in beneath their plastic awning to avoid the worst of the rain, and takes a seat on the bench before the cooks. The man and woman running the stand are soaked in sweat, spices, and cooking oil. Shakiso receives no more than a querying glance, and she simply gestures that she will have whatever is available. Fish or goat, asked even as a bowl piled high with broken rice is set before her. Fish, she answers, and for the cat, nodding to where Tuft has set her paws on the bench. A dollop of fish is added to her rice, and another bowl with the same plonked alongside it. Dinner is filling, if not tasty, and she soon makes way for the next person waiting patiently behind her for a space. It is too early for sleep, and with the rain easing into a cool evening, she finds herself ambling randomly through the camp, savouring the polyglot of language and culture merging and mingling. There may be someone able to put her up for the night, and if not, there is always the damp discomfort of the boat. Red and orange flames flicker, bright and welcoming, and she follows alongside with groups of people heading for the fireside. Hundreds have gathered here, families sharing their evening meal, teenagers laughing and whispering secrets, young lovers exchanging lingering glances. Before them, alongside the heat of the flame, stands a bone-thin man dressed in a greyed and careworn bubu. His eyes are pearled with age, and his hair an olive-coloured burst about his head. He leans on a long two-headed metal stave surrounded by people who seem awed merely to be close to him. That is Gorgon of the genie, come to tell us her story, says a mother to her children, who look as if they do not know whether to be thrilled or terrified. An elderly woman waves emphatically at Shakiso. You will be our guest, she says, inviting her and making space amongst the blankets, pots and plates. Shakiso is engulfed into the bosom of quite a large extended family. They are from Bamako and have been in the camp for almost a year, awaiting their chance to cross the desert. With that Shaitin gone, we hope we'll be safe to cross, says the old woman, handing Shakiso an enormous enamel mug of overly sweetened tea. Gorgon raises his stave above his head, and the drumming rises, stopping instantly as he slams its foot deep into the earth at his sandals. Shakiso feels as if the ground trembles, and for a moment he stares directly at her, knowing her, recognition in his nod and smile. She blinks, and his eyes are flickering flame as he takes up a handful of dust, makes a fist of it, and casts it into fire, even as he begins to speak. So that's diving in at the deep end into the contextless form of one part of what I write. It is not what the book is about in terms of narrative, but very much about what it is.
Great, and that's from the new novel, Our Memory of Dust, Our Memory Like Dust, and your second novel. And has anybody here actually read any of Gavin's work yet? At all? Paul has? Yeah, and Lament from the Fallen has been described in a nutshell, which isn't always the best way books being honest, as being like the man who fell to earth in Africa, which there's a lot. That's not really a very accurate description. There's an awful lot in it, and I think what drew me to it was the fact that even though ostensibly you're writing science fiction, or maybe as we were saying earlier on fantasy, that it fulfills the function which SF is very good at, which is metaphor, and good science fiction is more often than not writing about the world we live in now as much as any positive future. And what struck me about both the books is about how much you're writing about what's happening in Africa, the Middle East and Europe now. So the books are very, very relevant. And there seems to be a sea change at the moment where we are seeing more voices being published in SF from outside traditional British and American values, which is very good. Gavin, you are from Africa and you've been in Britain for 10 years,
yeah.
I understand. And can you give us your background to give us more context and about your work in science as well?
Yeah. So my upbringing, my own foundational myth is for a lot of Europeans of my age, it might have been the fall of the Berlin Wall. For me, it was the end of apartheid. And when I was finishing school, Nelson Mandela was coming out of prison. And when I was in university, it was the first election and that transition period. And over that period and up until around about 10 years ago, I worked in the townships as a student volunteer with a student-run charity, and then after that running my own charitable organisation that did development. And one of the things I was very conscious of with the first novel, when I came to write it, was sure, the man who fell to earth, but very much not white man in Africa. I mean, you can't watch a movie or read a book about white man in Africa. Constant Gardener being one that comes to mind, where it's not white man's burden or white man's saviour, and everybody else is just yes boy. The idea is, having travelled extensively in Africa, is people are just living their own lives. You're of no consequence, really. You're there, and they're happy to see you, but you're not there to save them, and it never occurs to anybody that you are there to save them, and they'd be quite repelled by the idea as to why you'd even be thinking that. I wrote an essay years ago called "Hi, we're the Martians. We're just arrived. We're here to help." I think we'd be somewhat offended. And I spent a good 15 years of my life travelling an hour backwards and forwards from the centre of Cape Town with all its glass and steel buildings that doesn't look very different from Europe into the informal settlements. And then a lot of that informed what I was writing because it's a realised African city in Nigeria filled with real Nigerians who have their own agenda and their own lives, and this outsider comes in and disrupts that agenda and is an inconvenience, but he's also their guest. And so that was sort of, based on some of my lived experience of working, of running backwards and forwards, of doing things to try and bring about economic development. My background is scientific, microbiology and biochemistry, and then electrical engineering. And these days I work mostly in data science, which is using data to do economic and social development. So that's mostly on that sort of background. To pick up on a science fiction fantasy question, I mean, for me the line is in conservation of energy. Is that if at any point you're achieving more than you put in, then it's fantasy. If you push something here and you get a massive explosion there without any extra effort, then that's fantasy. And I would classify myself as exclusively science fiction, but people tell fantastic stories because we try and reduce the infinite to something that we can explain. And people living through big events reduce them to stories that they can tell children and tell each other. And so you get that mix of fantasy, but the fantasy is not present. The books themselves must obey conservation of energy. Whatever happens has to be feasible. It has to be realistic. My bad guys are not morons. They're evil, they're unable to understand reality, but they're not complete morons. They do scare the hell out of me.
So, to sort of jump on some of the immediate things that come up in the books, I mean, there's the writing is very poetic and very gritty, and there's a lot of great vocabulary in there. But as I say, what really drew me in to the stories was the fact that you are talking about the future, which is the day after tomorrow. In the new book, the jihadis and the invisibility folks, the idea of a steel wall across the Mediterranean. And I remember it does get set, I think, 50 years from now, when it could really be the day after tomorrow. And I think that really is quite something. And there is a kind of strength in that, in the international approach that you bring to the work because of your background, your perspective, which is really refreshing, because I think we, in the UK, for quite a long time, in British SF, there was a big movement from about 1987 onwards to the Starship and the Zapgun. And I'm well known for being somebody who looks down quite a lot on space opera, even though I do like the odd thing. I think your work's very refreshing in that you are looking at near future things, and we're looking at parts of the world that we hear about a lot in the news all the time, and yet very often in SF we don't tackle them.
Yeah.
And there's the danger of being provincial in a huge universe, and I think that's what's great about your work. You don't allow us to be provincial. It's saying we need to look at this. And a book that immediately came to mind when I started looking at work was Christopher Priest's Street for a Darkening Island, which came out in 1971, which is about something that's happening now: refugees coming across from Africa and coming to Europe, and Europe asking itself some tough questions, both morally and practically, about what it's going to do. And your books, are addressing those things. But they also have these wonderful, fantastic elements, which, as you say, obey your rules. Like in the first book, the space prison, the sudden appearance of this man. And really, in a way, what you're writing is probably more relevant than somebody writing a mainstream novel about Africa now, because you're using the power of metaphor.
Yeah.
And was it just your background as a science fiction reader that meant that when you were writing these stories, you felt you had to express them in an SF way?
I think that the thing about science fiction is you're usually posing yourself a Gedanke experiment, some sort of thought experiment. Is what happens if? And I mean, I love science fiction, but a lot of science fiction is dystopias, and dystopias in many ways are a cop out. It's really easy to break something, and I'm really frustrated with modern contemporary superhero movies where they're permanently blowing up American cities. And it's really easy to blow up a city, but quite frankly, guys, let's talk about it. That's genocide that's happening right there. It's got a nice, profound ending, and everybody's happy, but 100,000 people probably died. And the reality is, we're actually living through an era where there's a lot of destruction and despair. And the question I posed myself is, well, what's next? I mean, it's easy to write to give way to despair, but if we want to talk about how we get from here to something positive, how do we do that? And that's science fiction then becomes the medium that you have to then use, because it becomes the only way you can then ask that question and answer it, which a lot of early science fiction was mostly around those sorts of thoughts experiments.
Yes. Yeah.
What happens if we do? And sometimes they lead you to terrible places, and sometimes they lead you to ideal places.
It's funny because you're very much a hopeful writer. You want to express in the books some dreadful things happen, but you are about hope. You are, in that sense, a utopia writer. And I just wanted to Emma sitting there at the back, and I want to bring Emma in, if I could, to you just for a moment, because I've just read Planetfall, and Emma's second book in that series, After Atlas, is you're both doing very clever things. You're writing things which aren't quite series yet; they appear to be like series. And I mean, your two books are about hope as well. So far, I mean, there's the hope that leads people to colonise another world in Planetfall, and then there's the story of the people who stay behind in After Atlas. And can I sort of get both of you in here and say, how important is it when we have this massive background of dystopian writing in science fiction, which we love because it's often great and dramatic and says great things, but how important is it to, at this stage where the world is now and where science fiction is now, to be hopeful and to project images of hope?
I mean, one of the things I read recently was about contemporary science fiction was that we don't have that sort of sense of the excitement of the future that science fiction from the last century did. You know,
The
where's
sense
our
of
Star
wonder.
Trek? Where's our Star Trek? Where's our modern version of that? I mean, even something like now I've just forgotten the name of it. The series, the Netflix series set on the edge of our universe.
Expanse?
The Expanse.
Yeah, James Clyde.
I mean, it's very reductive. I mean, there's only 3 actual societies. How do you get to a point where there's only 3 societies? You know, planet Earth is just the UN. How's that going? The UK can't even agree on what it is as one little place, and somehow or other we're suddenly all the UN.
Well, the world is messy and complex, isn't it?
And so it's like, well, Star Trek, you know, was this idea of a messy, complex universe, but full of wonder. And every episode was about exploring a different thing and a different way of living. We don't really have that. I think a lot of
because
science.
we grew up. Because, I mean, Star Trek Next Gen, I was obsessed with as a teenager. And I actually think that a lot of my moral compass was informed by Star Trek Next Gen, probably more than my own school. Because Picard is such a good man, and I really do feel like there was something very magical that was given to me. But then I grew up, and it's like a shit. And is that what is happening to us globally in science fiction as authors, that we all had that time as children and then we grew up and now we're furious? I am constantly enraged about everything.
Yeah.
And so I can either go insane, I can run up and down streets with placards, I can try and kill people, or I can write books. And I wonder if there is something like that is happening with us, maybe. I don't know.
It can be. I mean, I suppose my sense of identity was informed a lot by where I was working as a 19-year-old. You know, I was. I mean, my earliest sort of founding memories of being in a cardboard shack in the rain with somebody who is trying to feed 2 children on her own and helping her to figure out the pricing for her business. And that's hope. And then to come into a country like the UK, which is, you know, for me, this is the future, hey? You know, this is Star Trek. And everyone's so miserable.
Look at our politicians, my God!
Okay, so your politicians are
Also
more
miserable. We
okay,
have
but
this amazing thing, and now we're all hacking it up and trashing
which is
it.
fine, but I suppose it's more that it's more that there is this sense of this disjoint, this disconnect. A lot of people on the planet are living through an incredible expression of hope. They are getting wealthier faster than they've ever gotten in their lives. They are experiencing. I mean, if you live in a small village in the middle of Africa, you have a mobile phone. You can call anyone in the world, and they do. They know everything that's going on. Okay, they have Facebook groups. I was in Nigeria. I was invited to a social media week where people were using YouTube and stuff and totally uninterested in anything that was going on in the West. They had their own stories and they were using this technology to tell their own stories. And it was like, so cool. So for the West, maybe you're going through this miserable period where you're not top dog and you're not the one setting the agenda anymore. And maybe that is causing this massive cry of rage.
Oh, definitely, yeah. There are lots of very upset, mediocre white men trying to...
There's a lot of very mediocre white men who are very upset.
Definitely, I agree. And that was one of the really interesting things about, because I've read the first one, The Lament of the Fallen, and I thought it was really incredible that you had this kind of backstory of these 2 people who come up with this idea of hope, and one decides to take it into space and one decides to stay at home. And I cried when they realised who each other was, when Joshua travels, and that there was this kind of...
There was a setup, I'm so pleased.
Yeah. I cried in a restaurant, so well done. And it was something so beautiful that, you know, this idea of like seeds being planted and things like that. But in the background to this, you know, we cut occasionally to the Americans being complete evil bastards And this kind of juxtaposition of your utopia and your dystopia playing out at the same time. And I found that really, really enjoyable to read. And also the kind of a background kind of anger that I felt in myself when he went up to, I don't know if it's a Chenia or a Chania, I don't know how you Kenya, thank you. And when he went there, and it was like the typical Clarke thing of, you know, advanced science looks no different to magic, and it's like magic there, and things are levitating. And I was thinking, well, what about the people left behind, and what about the unevenness of utopia, and how some people have it like we have it. The epigraph
on the first line of the book is the summary of that sense, which I'll just quickly read. It says, even as some would explore the stars, remember that many who remain behind scratch out an existence of near starvation in the dust so easily shed.
Yeah.
And I did. I played with the idea of choice. A lot of dystopic science fiction seem to lead to the idea there is no choice. There's only one ending. And I wanted to play with the idea of coffee tea. You know, if I offer you coffee and tea, there's no wrong choice. That's different. And so there is a choice. One group is going to go off and explore the stars, and one group is going to stay and fix and make this place what they want it to be. But now he has a target. He knows what it'll look like when he's done. Spoilers.
Thematically, there is a tie to Emma's books, which we'll talk about next month. Now, I haven't got Emma's books up here, but I've already been on to them tonight. We do have them downstairs, I can bring them up. But something this has reminded me of is just struck me now, of J.G. Ballard. Because Ballard, of course, was British, European, but he grew up in China, in Shanghai, and his dad was a rich businessman. And he was there when the Japanese invaded. And if you've ever read Empire of the Sun or seen the Steven Spielberg film, the young Jim, grows up in the prison camp. And it's quite funny because, of course, as soon as Spielberg gets hold of anything, he sentimentalises it and pushes it into the family unit, what have you. And you get the John Williams music. And I used to love John Williams when I was young, and then I grew up. Plus, you know, he wasn't such a good composer afterwards. His jazz elements dropped away. But the point I want to make is that when Ballard came to Britain after World War II, you know, he thought it was going to be, you know, great, the modern world, and it was very grey and what have you. And people watch Empire of the Sun, the film typically, or read it, and they think that Jim had a really terrible time. Well, from our perspective, he did. But of course, he also, what you see in the book is he's enjoying a lot of it. It's a playground. It's like Michael Moorcock said about in London after the war, the bomb sites are where he played. You know, and science fiction writers, you know, they take their breakfast in the ruins, you know, and there is that aspect of it. So really, you come into Britain and giving us this vision of Africa and saying it's not monolithic, it's not one thing, it's many things. It's a bit like what Ballard did in his fiction, where he took the raw material of the drain swimming pools he saw and all these things, and he pushed it into his SF. And when Empire came out, you know, a good 20 years after he started writing professionally, you read it and you thought, oh, hang on a minute, this is where all that stuff comes from, in the Drowned World and all the short stories, the Terminal Beach, all these things. And you think, this is it. And it's interesting that you, a European, but born in Africa, grown up in Africa, you know, it takes, you're bringing it all back home to us, you know, and you're showing us and challenging our perceptions, and that's very healthy. And I think we need in SF, we need other voices, and I think I'm sure Emma will agree as well. We're seeing more SF in translation, more SF coming from different parts of the world. I mean, we're seeing some Chinese SF coming through now, which is fascinating because, I mean, back when I first started reading SF, you got a bit of Russian stuff if you were lucky. You get Stanislaw Lem from Poland. There were quite a few anthologies of Russian SF, and you'd get a bit of Strugatsky brothers if you were lucky. But no, you know, we are seeing more. There's some Cuban SFs being published in England and the UK, so we are getting a more international thing, and you know, and that's good, and it's good for writers as well, because you know, you need the competition to get your game.
The stories, because I mean, everybody has stories, but there's slightly different rhythms and tones in other cultures, and also I think that for writers who have lived through different big historical events and have a completely different perspective on them, then it gives you a different flow as well. I mean, you know, the 5-body product, the 3-body product.
Yeah.
as a sort of Chinese approach to the Cultural Revolution, and using that in sci-fi is really clever. But yeah, I think that, you know, if we're telling these stories, and think of a movie like Life is Beautiful, set in a concentration camp, but showing that people were still laughing and still having fun. The reality is that even in the worst of dystopias, people get up in the mornings and hope that tomorrow or today will improve. I do find dystopias that are written very superficially, where everybody's just miserable all the time. It's like, well, it wouldn't function as a society. It just wouldn't function. Because nobody would do anything. There'd be so much lethargy.
You should visit Bulgaria.
Or the north.
At this stage, I'd like to go on with the dystopian thing a bit longer, because I did suggest we read 1984 for this. This is an experimental format, so people haven't read the books, don't worry. I thought if anybody would like to ask any questions at this stage of Gavin at all.
I'm just curious, because you spoke of so much hope in Africa and general sort of misery here. I'm interested why you live here. Why not stay where you feel there's hope?
Two things. South Africa does not have that. I am very much about the leverage of my ability. And my ability is mostly around interpretation of information to bring about change. Yeah, and in my case, it's public health and economic. And in South Africa, that opportunity went out the window when the ANC elected Jacob Zuma as president. It was South Africa's moron moment. Jacob Zuma is the spiritual cousin of a certain orange-haired baboon. When that moment happened, then I could see the future. I knew that South Africa would be captured by this group of people, and it would go in a particular direction. And I didn't want to waste my life fighting against that. And I happened to meet a chap at the time who was a mentor of mine, a tremendous social scientist who fought apartheid and one of the great researchers. And he was 70 years old, and he'd been fighting his whole life, and he hadn't got anywhere. And I was thinking, this is me at his age, if I stay. And I won't achieve anything. And I looked around the world, and I was trying to figure out, well, where is best for me to place myself so that I can achieve as much as I can in the life I have. And the best place for me at the time was the UK. And since then I have gradually built up my consulting work, and at this point I consult globally. So it was the right thing to do professionally. And sometimes you have to leave the place that you really care about in order to try and bring about that change. So I mean, it's a difficult personal thing, and it's probably too complex to explain briefly, but that's the best I can do it.
Anybody have any questions for Gavin at all? Emma?
Are you hopeful on a large scale? There's a lot of really great examples of hopeful things on a micro scale that I see in the world. But when I look at larger forces and political forces that have a huge amount of power, I get very despondent and enraged. How do you feel about that?
Despondent and enraged is probably the right feeling for it. My feeling is we are living through an incredible period of transition where for the last 100 years at least, China, India, Latin America, Africa have basically shot themselves in the head every day. And the beneficiaries of that have been Western Europe and North America. Not through being smarter or better, just from not having shot yourself in the head every single day. And now you're suddenly seeing a rebalance as people in China decide to actually build things and make things and invent things and to get rich. And people of the world are doing that. And it was probably inevitable that the contradictions that you've lived with in the UK and the US and other places would eventually just come to light. I mean, quite frankly, I look at the modern two-party state in the UK and in the US, and they're almost identical. You have a right-wing party that is conflicted between being happy with what you do but not with who you are, and a left-wing party that is happy with who you are but not with what you do, which, to put it in the terminology of politics, is, the one likes business and it doesn't like social liberty, and the other likes social liberty and doesn't like business. I mean, it's, you're fundamentally conflicted as a party. So it was inevitable that you'd get Donald Trump. And if we survive Donald Trump, so if he doesn't nuke anybody in the next year, which is a great risk, then that rebalancing will mean that America and Europe will fade into relative importance. They'll still be important, they just won't be dominant. I mean, it'd be nice to be watching movies and read books that are not always American superheroes. So my view is we have to navigate this terrible, cancerous lump, orange cancerous lump. And if we can, then I think it'll be okay. It'll be up to the strength of character of everybody, really, of the majority of people, to decide that we don't want the worst to happen. And if we can just decide, I think a lot of, maybe it needed a cartoon. Maybe if it'd been somebody smart and subtle, we might not have noticed. But because we've got the biggest morons on the planet in charge of Brexit and in charge of the US government, maybe it's so obvious that, it'll be okay. I don't know.
I found it interesting with the Kenya, how it was talking about how people could form their own kind of micro groups effectively and move between them, and that there was no sense of nation. Do you think that our sense of nation is something that hobbles us in the real world? I wondered how much of your own feelings were coming through in that portrayal of... I think our sense of nation does hobble us, because people have, very mobile identities. You're a major sci-fi fan, you're a major, beer fan, and maybe these two groups don't always see each other eye to eye, and you move between them. And your politics also shift. Some days you're really, really behind certain ideas of one person, but on another day you disagree with them fundamentally. And yet you don't have that ability with politics or with nation. But you do have that online. I mean, if you think about the way you form friendships and nations online, it's really, really fluid. And so we're trapped in this kind of sense of, well, it's really easy to do this online, and it's really difficult to do this physically. So, what happens if there weren't borders at all? What would happen? It wouldn't happen that everybody's just magically going to suddenly turn up. A lot of people really like where they live. Not because it's wealthy or because it's, well structured, or even the government's good, but because this is home. A lot of people do have a very strong attachment to ground. And I think, though, that if you could have that attachment to ground, but not have that then politics imposed on you, it would probably make things easier.
I think this... Sorry, Julian, I just want... While things are in my head, what I find fascinating about this is that we've mentioned Star Trek Next Gen earlier, and you, of course, anybody who loves SF or has written it or been involved with it for a long time gets very frustrated. If you took a sample of all people out there in Bar tonight who thought science fiction was escapism, they'd be really shocked by a lot of this because it's so serious. But it is serious stuff, and I think as science fiction writers and readers, sometimes we are angry, and it's a great way of exploring that anger and trying to find change. Because I think the one word that sums up SF for me is the word change. It's about change. It's the change that we perceive that might happen, that has happened, is happening. And it's a great way of looking at change and making us question what we can do that's positive, or what we can rail against. And there's a huge history of of SF coming out of political ideas. And I think you could almost write a history of science fiction coming out of politics, he said, thinking about a book over his head. So, you know, and we talked, I said the format of these things is experimental. So did anybody actually read the book club books I said at all?
I didn't have time to refresh 1984, but I've read it a few times.
Good. And did anybody else read Earth Abides or 1984? Yeah, good. Yeah, and I wanted to talk about 1984, and I want to bring Gavin.
And I must admit, Casual Believers is one of my favourite books. So.
Yeah. And I think that the thing that fascinates me about 1984 is in my job as a bookseller and as a huge SF fan and a fan of good writing per se, is that I'm always telling customers that they say, well, what's good, you know, and you reckon, you say, what do you like? And you recommend things. And sometimes you think, oh, I do wish they'd read a good SF novel. And so I don't like science fiction. And I always say the same thing. Have you read 1984? And they would say, yes. Have you read Brave New World? Yes. Have you read Fahrenheit 451? Yes. Have you read The Handmaid's Tale? And you get this huge list. And they're nearly all dystopian novels, of course. And one reason why I said maybe we talk about 1984 was the fact that people forget how SF it is. And people say, it's not very SF. It is. It's one of those funny things. And I read it every year, and I must have read it 25, 30 times. And it's interesting, as you were saying earlier on, a society like that wouldn't function. Could people really cope? Would it just fall apart? Would it ever even come to exist in the first place? And that's a key question. And it shows, you know, Orwell, being a science fiction fan himself, he wrote an essay about Wells and the impact of Wells on his reading as a child, and the obvious impact of Wells on his writing, which is there in a book called Coming Up for Air as well, which is like a precursor to 1984. And you look at 1984 today, and it's a novel set after a limited nuclear war. It says that in a text. It envisages the Cold War, which was just starting to happen then, but it's set after a minor nuclear war, which luckily didn't happen. And I think Orwell's work obviously is still with us, surveillance society, all those things. There are some very science fictional things in it, like he talks very briefly about the floating fortresses, which are bolted to the bottom of the ocean, and they stay guarding these things. People forget these little details. There's the obvious things like the brainwashing in Room 101, the rewriting of history, the superstates, all the stuff that clearly comes out of his critique of Soviet communism. But there's a lot of pure SF things in there as well. When the atomic bomb fell on Colchester is a line out of the book. And it's done very, very deftly, so deftly that people forget. And I think what we see in a lot of writing is that there's an awful lot of writing out there which is published as science fiction, but it's not marketed as such. And this is interesting because it leads into your work.
But picking up on the negativity, because I mean, he was clever enough to realise that a purely negative society wouldn't survive. Because I mean, if you think about it, you know, it's very hinted at, it's very subtly, the proletariat.
Yes.
Because the people you're experiencing in the book are actually the elite.
Yes.
They're a thin veneer on the top.
Yeah.
The proletariat are controlled through pictures and movies and manufactured stories and trivialities, and they're invisible really. But those are the people that kind of allow the society to survive. It's the elite that have to be controlled in the way that and in that case, North Korea comes to mind.
Yeah. It's funny as well, one thing in Orwell that strikes me is that, as you say, it's the elite. We're talking about the people called the outer party, and you get glimpses of the inner party of the bride. But they are 15% of the population of Oceania, is what it says in the book. And of course, they're all bureaucrats. They're all doing pointless things. They're rewriting history. They're burning files. They're rewriting things. And I think a lot of us in different jobs we've had have found ourselves doing these things, and we're thinking, why are we doing these things? Purely the support. Bureaucracy is a self-perpetuating evil, isn't it? And that's that thing. So when you're thinking, I'm doing this because if we didn't do this, somebody wouldn't have a job to make us do this, and so on. So it's very subtle as well. So dystopia can be a very melodramatic thing, a very subtle thing as well.
But it's happening in the real world now. I mean,
absolutely.
in Trump's administration, they've had people dumping climate data from government systems and other aspects in the justice system having huge amounts purged. You know, when the administration changed, having scientists backing up files because they knew that politicians were going to order that data be destroyed. And that is, I cannot believe I'm sitting here saying that this is happening now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was so much in 1984 that, we're all saying this is happening now. And I think it's interesting what you say about the proletariat. I feel like a member of the proletariat at the moment. I'll watch Netflix. I will have my 15 minutes of rage where I will shout and scream in the kitchen and be furious about everything. But can I do a goddamn thing about it? Well, no, I don't feel I can at the moment. Politically, I feel disempowered.
It's approachable. I mean, I'm part of the community of people that is doing stuff around this. My community is open data, freedom of information. Those are my sort of peers in my profession. So one group of people were part of the American group that frantically backed up the data. I'm a volunteer with What Do They Know, doing freedom of information requests. We're challenging the government regularly to get information out. The fact is that to be an activist these days, to do something positive, has actually never been easier. You don't need to go and crawl through a minefield. You don't need to do what George Orwell did and go and join the Spanish Civil War, which is offered risk. Yeah. You can actually sit down at a computer and just download some online tools and start work.
Can we have a conversation after this?
so it's if we were hoping for, as you say, we've grown up and got angry. We were hoping for escapism. This is the great ironies of SR. People think, it's just escapism, but for me, it's about escaping into reality, not from reality.
Hold your nose to it.
Yeah, very, very much so.
It will make you feel better. Paddy's really angry. Always. He has always been angry. I know.
Julian,
the anger.
I want to. I would love to. I've tried things and it hasn't worked, so I would love to find something else that does. Yeah.
Well, you can take it out in the writing.
I'm doing that too.
I'm sure you are. Gillian, you wanted to say something else?
I wanted to go back to the book, if it's alright. I haven't read it, but the mechanics of writing. Did you see the whole story beginning to end in your head? Did you write it on like a mood board or a map or something?
No.
Or did you just start and it ran away with itself?
No. I cannot speak for other writers, and I know some writers have incredibly sophisticated methodology to storyboard their stories. I start with a general idea, usually a sense of something that is going to happen, and then I get I don't know how to call it, almost freezes, a freeze of a thing, where the first scene I saw in Our Memory Like Dust is the scene that happens at the end of the first part. For those, this is spoilers. So, and essentially the idea is that my hero, the classic stranger, is standing naked in the desert, surrounded by jihadis, all with their guns pointed at his head. And as he's doing that, thousands of people come over the hills of the dunes, and each of them is carrying a camera, and each of them films. And I just had that scene in my head. I was like, I need to put that in something. It's so powerful. It's gripping. It's quite a. And I have a lot of images like that. And then I have a notebook, and I scribble them down, and I have no idea where they fit. So a lot of the time I write, and I'll write a chapter. For me, it's like there's the writing process. I kind of come up with a whole bunch of stuff, and then I sit down and I write a narrative, and then I figure out what the order is, because sometimes you discover that what you thought was at the end is actually at the beginning, and so they don't work quite this kind of. I don't feel like a mechanical writer that sits down and goes, I will now, I have no idea. And for me, I also start by assembling music. I collect a vast amount of music. So at the end of each book, there's playlists, and you can go onto Spotify and you can listen to that playlist of music, which is all African music, and it's all from the area. And then when I write, then certain songs go with certain chapters. And when I write that chapter, I listen to the song and I try and get the rhythm and the tone of the song into the words. So that's sort of my approach, and I find that it works for me. But I can't really say that it will help anybody else.
There isn't any one answer, is there? Writers say such different and diverse
Yeah.
things about how they work. And I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Just to reflect again on 1984 and what part of the intention of this is to try and take people through the recent history of SF, trying to put the reading into context. That's experimental, I'm not sure it's working. But the 1950s...
I'll gush about catapult.
I'm going to let you do that in a moment. The 1950s is interesting. I mean, now we've got North Korea, which you all know about that, and oh great, nuclear weapons. And of course, that was the thing which was coloured in the 1950s. Orwell saw it, and it was in a lot of SF at the time. And we have been going through a renaissance of the sort of post-catastrophe SF in recent publishing. I mean, another book I chose for if anyone wants to read was George R. Stewart's Earth Abides, which I mention all the time. Has anybody read this at all? Good stuff. What do we think of it?
Yeah, quite a positive
Yeah.
view of people, isn't it?
Very much so.
Generally.
Yeah.
Did anybody read The Stand by Stephen King? Because I read The Stand as a 13-year-old. So I read this for the
Yeah.
book club. And I read it, I was like, well, this is the sort of
Yeah.
happy version of The Stand.
And I brought this up because, I mean, like Orwell wasn't a genre SF writer. He didn't write for, the pulp magazines. I sometimes think he probably would have been quite shocked by some of them, but we don't know that much about whether he actually read any pulp magazines. There's some things that he did. But Stewart was an agronomist, and this was the only SF novel he wrote, so he was an expert on agriculture, which isn't surprising when you read this. And I think I keep putting it in people's faces because of two recent bestsellers, one book which I really, really enjoyed, which I thought was superb, which is The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which probably a lot of people have read, and I read that in one sitting. And sometimes I struggle with McCarthy. I think sometimes he overwrites dreadfully, other times he's too bald, but when he nails it, I think he's brilliant. But I did think of this, because I think the thing that's really touching about this, I may do a slight spoiler here, is this is fundamentally, beside the fact that it takes place after a plague that decimates most of the population, but in a nice way, in quite a nice John Wyndham way. It's a nice John Wyndham way. It's the world's much less cluttered down, but it's much more fun. Just typical science fiction. Oh, we hate everybody, we hate everything. But it's about a man's relationship with his son, and that's very much in The Road as well. The Road is an incredibly harsh book. I've only read one harsher post-apocalyptic novel than that. It's not a novel, it's Harlan Ellison's A Boy and His Dog, which is a novella. But also there was a book called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Anybody read that? That, again, is a post-plague thing. But it's also got a thing about words, because this, I'm not going to do a spoiler, but this book really is about words and the importance of the word and the written word. And it's very, very beautiful. So do read it one day, because it's a really, really marvellous book. And I'm predicting that in 10 years' time, somebody in the UK in the media will discover it and it'll become really famous. That's about to happen with Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, because it's been published with the cover of a mainstream novel. And that's going to break through. In America, obviously, every kid in school reads it. But do read this one day if you haven't, because it is really a beautiful novel, really, really great book. And it does fulfil that wonderful psychological thing, which John Wyndham was really good at, which was, let's decimate the world, but it's all going to be okay in time for tea. Again, that says a lot, I think, about... There's a brilliant, brilliant story by a writer called Charles Platt. Charles Platt was one of the architects of English New Wave science fiction in the 1960s. I met him once, really great guy. And he wrote a story called The Disaster Story, and it's very short, and it's basically a set of 10 rules for how you write a disaster novel. and it's brilliant, because it's so cynical, but it also reveals why we love these things, because it says, I will survive, the world will be depopulated, but I will find a way. I will find a woman, she will be beautiful. And it goes through all the things which became cliches, in the works of people like John Wyndham and that. And of course, all these books are actually not that cosy after all. They've got social Darwinism and all sorts of things in them. But it's this great formula, and they're saying, off you go, Wyndham, off you go, Christopher. We'll do it the way Ballard does it. But it's actually great, because you're going, yeah, and it's just a wonderful thing because we are excited by this idea of having to survive and a depopulated world, probably because it's so overpopulated, and that spreads into things like The Walking Dead, which all those zombie apocalypses and things, which don't have an idea in their heads, they all come from Richard Matheson. So we do like the idea of a world depopulated and desolated, but in a nice way. Which brings me to your favourite, Accountable for Leibowitz.
Yeah, you should also look up online how to write about Africa, and they did a beautiful YouTube video on it, which you should look up, which is every stereotype about, never forget to talk about the light in Africa. And of course, the very classic stereotypes. But Canticle Leibowitz was one of the earliest science fiction stories that I read, 11 or 12.
Has anybody else here read Canticle Leibowitz?
Yeah.
It's a book that's a lot less famous now than it should be.
It's tremendous. For starters, I think it's one of those, if you've read it, you'll recognise the influence on me in terms of different non-contiguous stories. There's 3 different stories. They happen at 3 completely different epochs after a nuclear holocaust has destroyed half the planet. And essentially it's this society grappling with trying to interpret the past, trying to understand what it was. And the first story is they have no idea what the past was. They have turned ordinary leaflets and bits of advertising, flim-flam, and whatever documents
and
they
shopping
found.
list.
Shopping lists. They've turned. They're like medieval scribes. They're retranscribing it beautifully with gold leaf and with rare things, but they can't read it. They don't know what it is.
So these monks, and they're doing this. There's the wonderful part where one of them is doing the illuminated manuscript version of a printed circuit as well, which is stuck in my head. I can see that moment.
And they go through to this this library where they're attempting to put it back together again, and they think they're starting to understand. And it runs through 3 different eras as they recover this, and then destroy themselves all over again. But it's just.
But there is hope.
There is hope because the library takes off as a space rocket. And in between, there's this weird dude called Leibowitz who just wanders around in each epoch.
He's the wandering Jew, right?
Yes. And the rest of it is vaguely Catholic.
And it goes in and out of print. There was a time. When I bought my copy in the 80s. And it was published in Black Swan. It was published as a mainstream novel.
But it's also this fabulous thing of taking your story to where it goes and then stopping. I have to rate writers who do that, who go to the point of the story is finished and finish it. And leave it there. And if that doesn't answer everything for you, well, too bad. The story is done.
Just to go a bit further, we next month Emma is back. Yay! And some of us have been reading Planetfall and After Atlas, and we're looking forward to that. But we are, hopefully, if anybody wants to read the book choices, I'm trying to get this going, we will talk about 50s American SF and what happened there. And I picked 2 books which are both very dear to my heart, because it's all about what I like reading. But I picked the 2 people. American SF in the 1950s is astonishing. We talk about the golden age and they say, oh yes, Asimov, Heinlein, Sturgeon, whatever. And I find Asimov unreadable. I find Heinlein unreadable. I love Van Vogt. I think Sturgeon's overrated. But the 50s American SF was really incredible because what you got was guys like Alfred Bester and Philip K. Dick. Amongst many others, Frederick Paul, Cyril Kornbluth, Robert Sheckley, who were guys who were there in 50s America, the McCarthy at Madhouse. Everybody in Hollywood was being asked, are you now, or have you ever been a communist? Getting blacklisted. But these writers were writing really subversive, anti-McCarthyite, anti-authoritarian things. And they were doing it not only with great wit and great irony, but also with explosive styles. They were the master satirists. One day, the mainstream is going to realise that the finest satirical writing had to come out of America after Mark Twain and before Kurt Vonnegut, who of course started as a science fiction writer, as you know, except the mainstream won't let us have him back, was these guys. And Bester won the first ever Hugo Award with this book in 1953, and The Demolishment. I've just reread it first time for years, and it's about a businessman who's going to kill his business rival in the future, except nobody's committed a murder for 70 years because the police are telepathic, and there's telepaths everywhere. And it's about how you commit a murder with telepaths everywhere. And if you do commit a murder, you become demolished. And demolition is not what you think it's going to be, it's something else. And what Bester was great at, he was great at very florid, stylized writing. He used comic poetry techniques. If I can find the page, which I'm just going to... Right, okay. This is... just going to give you an idea. This is at a party that one of the characters go to, where everybody is telepathic, and that's their conversation. Okay? That's their mental conversation. Okay? And that's just when he used to do things like that a lot. And he was an incredible guy. He became a really big magazine editor, and he abandoned science fiction after writing 2 amazing novels. And his very best work is short stories. And if there was a short story collection, we'd do that, because his short stories kick his novels out the water, and the novels are great. And that's great fun. And it's a book which is on fire. His book that comes after that, The Stars My Destination, also known as Tiger, is even better. But this was neglected. So if you want to see what was happening in the early 50s, and this guy changed the game. People like William Gibson, Samuel R. Delany, Richard Morgan will say, without Bester, we wouldn't be here. You know, it's very, very much the thing. He sort of brought things screaming into literary modernism. And Philip K. Dick, well, we all know the name Philip K. Dick. Yeah. He's got a TV series starting on Sunday night on Channel 4. Electric Dreams, which there's 10 episodes looking at short stories, and they're doing some really obscure ones, and they're doing some really famous ones as well. And I love Philip K. Dick. I discovered Philip K. Dick in 1976 when I picked up a book from John Menzies in my hometown in South Wales that had the words, "Do androids dream of electric sheep?" on the cover. And I thought, I'm having some of that. I was struggling with Robert Heinlein and Frank Herbert, these huge big books which were really not grabbing me. And I thought, yeah, that's a good question. I need to know the answer. And I picked it up. And then I never looked back. I mean, Dick was just incredible. I mean, the guy wrote 50 books. He was married 5 times. He was dead at 52. Exactly. Yeah. And he was just amazing. And I picked this book, Time Out the Joint, because famously, if you've ever seen The Truman Show, is the thing that gets referred to. But Time Out the Joint's really interesting because what Dick wanted to do, he wanted to be a respected mainstream literary writer and write serious novels about the way life was in America in the 50s. Nobody would buy them. He wrote about a dozen of them, and some of them are a bit iffy, but mostly they're great. Only one of them was published while he was alive. The rest all got published after he died, because of course Phil Dick, being Phil, unfortunately died just before Blade Runner was released. And of course, when Blade Runner came out, even though it wasn't a commercial success or a critical success in America, in Europe, we loved it, and it's grown and grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. And this book shows Dick doing an interesting thing where he takes his mainstream style, he sets a book in what appears to be 1950s America, but is actually something else. And this is the point where he makes a big step forward from being this pulp hack who would churn out. In 1 year, he wrote and published 30 stories. And this is a guy who could write 4 or 6 novels in a year. And some of them were a bit iffy, but a lot of them were masterworks. And this is where he took a big step up. And this was his most important book until a couple of years later when he produced The Man in the High Castle, which you all know about because it's been on Amazon. So those are the 2 things if you want to read next month. I do hope you give them a try, because you know I could talk about these guys for hours, and I'd like you to be able to feel you can as well, because they were just 2 of many geniuses from that period. Any more questions for Gavin at all? Anybody? No? Well, Thank you all very, very much indeed. If anybody wants a bit more beer, I think we could probably do a bit more beer. Gavin will sign books if anybody wants books signed. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'm sorry the chairs aren't very comfortable. There's something of getting more comfortable chairs. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Gavin. And Emma, who is like the special guest for free at the back.
Please subscribe, hit the like button because that makes a big difference apparently, and we'll see what else comes up. Bye for now.